this edition of the Pro Football Focus IDP podcast, The Nickel. I am once again your host, Walton Spurlin, and as we continue through the fantasy football playoff season, I'm happy once again to be joined by one of the most respected pundits and podcasters in all the IDP land, Mr. Ross Miles.
Thanks very much, Wally. It's good to be back, although coming off the somewhat disappointing Rams loss when I thought we had the game won, but that's football for you. I enjoyed the game. A lot. It's been a lot of fun these last few weeks watching the Rams play some difficult opponents despite the losses, and I'm thinking, let's make the playoffs and let's play them again. And that's the same attitude I try and bring to my fantasy football teams as well. You can't win every time.
That's right, and it's great to have a team that you cheer for that really has the playoffs in sight, as opposed to my Detroit Lions, who, despite a win last week against Tampa Bay, continue to be on the outside looking in, and I think that's probably going to continue. So I'll not lament that anymore, so that we can get to a jam-packed show full of news, notes, all the information that we can give you to help you continue on in your fantasy playoffs. For those of you that are continuing on, and for those that aren't, that are listening to us, well, thank you. Let's jump right into the news and notes. And boy, the linebacker position of late, Ross, has been suffering some pretty big injuries, and no more bigger ones than suffered by the Seattle Seahawks in their last game.
Indeed, yeah. Bobby Wagner left the game in the third quarter with a hamstring injury. Is something that has been plaguing him for a few weeks now. So the fact he's been able to complete games until last week, that's going to be a little bit of a concern. I mean, obviously they've got a crunch matchup next week against the Rams. They have to win to have a chance, essentially, of winning the division. So it's a big game for them. And yeah, that wasn't the only injury they took in the linebacker core, was it?
No, then K.J. Wright ended up leaving the game with a concussion, and boy, there's been a bevy of those lately in the division. The position. I mean, we had Telvin Smith once again was out this week with a concussion. Vontaze Burfict. It's the way things are trending. It's going to be hard pressed for K.J. Wright, to come back, and that really leaves Seattle in one of those almost last man standing situations at linebacker. I know there's some names, and I'm not sure if we'll get to them in waiver wire along those lines. I see one of the names there, but we can touch on him now. Michael Wilhoit is someone who's going to see an increase in playing time, and I scanned over the box score, and somebody named Terrence Garvin, not real familiar with him, had 33 snaps and 2 solos and a forced fumble. So it's your Rams are getting the Seahawks at a good time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to keep a close eye on Bobby Wagner. I mean, obviously he gets the veteran benefit of not necessarily practicing all week, but Wright is more of a fringe player. So if you own Wright, you're probably not starting him every week. If you are, you probably have a good alternative. But it's the Wagner owners I feel sorry for. Now, it's going to be Michael Wilhoit, who I think he will take over in the middle if Wagner can't make it. But he's not exactly a fantasy stud. And as you've kind of hinted at, the loss of Shazier, Burfict, Telvin Smith has missed 2 games. Wagner's out. Sean Lee's been missing for multiple weeks until now. So these are all a lot of LB1 or fringe LB1 players who have been missing. So hopefully you've taken advantage of players like Joe Schobert during the season who have really stepped up. But yeah, tricky one. Will Hoyt is the guy I think I would be picking up if I was going to try and take advantage of the injury situation in Seattle.
Right, that's a good point. And as we've touched on, the linebacker position in general, it's the bad time of year for this to happen. But a lot of big name linebackers are dropping out. You touched on Shazier. I believe they put him on IR. He's out. His immediate replacement was Matakevich, who we talked about last week. He wasn't able to go with a shoulder. I mean, they signed Sean Spence back to the team last week, and he ended up seeing 34 snaps. So that tells you, in the NFL, how depleted some teams are getting at linebacker. And we'll continue to look at the linebacker as fantasy football is depleted, because it looks like another big name linebacker for the Washington Redskins is maybe going to miss some time.
Yeah, it sounds that way. People were concerned when he left the game. He was on crutches and he was seen in a boot. But ESPN's John Keem is actually reporting it's not a season-ending injury. Maybe misses a week, but they're not going to send him to IR.
All right, and Zach Brown, of course, that we're speaking of, and he's had such a good year. I think a name to keep in mind is someone I believe we mentioned when Will Compton went out. Martrell Spate will probably see an uptick in snaps, and It's again getting to be slim pickings at the linebacker position. And another quick note I wrote down is as somebody who didn't have a good matchup last week, but AJ Klein of the Saints, he ended up only playing 7 snaps before leaving the game with a groin injury. So if he was somebody that you maybe had on your team as depth, now you can't really even count on him. And man, the linebacker position is just taking a beating. But there could be a really big loss at the top of the defensive back rankings this week as Giants' Landon Collins was seen in a walking boot after last week's game.
Yeah, he injured himself in the fourth quarter while he was tackling Cole Beasley on the end of a long run. But at the minute, we haven't got clarity on this situation. We're not quite sure how serious it is. But when you weigh it up, bigger picture, are the Giants really going to commit to getting this guy back on the field when it's essentially a lost season? I wouldn't be so sure.
Exactly. This could just be again, looking at the long-term picture here and just go ahead and shut Collins down to not make things worse. And while that would be, devastating from a fantasy standpoint, I'm sure the Giants probably aren't weighing that as part of their decision-making process. And we'll touch on one more secondary a player here. And I don't mean by that he's a secondary player, but plays in the secondary. And not sure how this will play out in the future, but this is someone who we touched on early in the year as he was going through some situations. That's Sewell Cravens of the Redskins. He's been medically cleared to return to football.
Yeah, which is good news. That we had a weird patch in the middle of the season where he mentioned retirement even, which was quite crazy. But in the shakeout from this, we're getting news that his agent says he was suffering from a post-concussion syndrome. He's undergone treatment now, and he is looking forward to getting back on the field next year. This is all really positive news for the former second-round pick. Obviously, he has had issues with concussions in the past, so that's something we're going to want to monitor. But he is a guy who I think could be a fantasy asset for many a team. So if you're in a dynasty format, you might want to consider him if he's available.
Right, might want to do a nice little grab and stash situation there before too many people get the news, and that's why you listen to us, so you can get the news first. Now we'll touch on a couple of defensive linemen, and the first one's having a really big year, and he's actually been doing it while playing through injury. That's Everson Griffin of the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, plantar fasciitis has been slowing down Griffin since he missed Week 10 with that very issue. Obviously, if you own him, he's been active for every game since. He's been on the field. This is something that's going to heal over the off-season, but it has slowed him a little bit. I say a little because he has had 3 sacks in those 4 games since that injury, but only 1 game of over 10 points. So he's been able to be productive in a pure splash play point of view, but the fantasy points haven't quite come through as they had done. It's just worth noting, this is something that's going to keep on grinding away. I think we're all pretty clear the Vikings are going to make the postseason, so I wouldn't be surprised if they did let him off a few snaps as we play through these next few weeks, because they really are going to want him come January.
Yeah, especially with his battery mate there, Danielle Hunter, not having the season that a lot of us expected. It's really been Griffin that has stepped up. You make a good point, Ross, that I could see them. Let's limit his snaps. Let's have him fresh for what's going to be the playoff grind. And somebody, whose team's not going to make the playoffs, and even if they did, it's likely he won't be playing for them. And that's Gerald McCoy of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And there's fears that he has suffered a torn biceps.
Yeah, one of the best defensive tackles from a fantasy perspective. If you play in a defensive tackle required league, McCoy's he will be owned by someone, and they will be starting him on a regular basis. But yeah, McCoy fears he suffered this injury, and if anyone's going to know, he would. He's already torn his bicep twice in his career. So yeah, I think the prevailing opinion is if he says he's torn it, he's probably torn it. He knows what that feels like.
Yeah, and I believe he knew right away because obviously they were playing against the Lions this week, so I was able to watch that game here in Detroit, and he was very emotional on the sideline. Coaches were coming up and talking to him and hugging him, and he was hugging, his defensive teammates and offensive players as well. There were tears involved, and you could tell, and I felt for him, especially somebody that loves IDP. Even playing against my Lions, football's better when Gerald McCoy's on the field, so. As you said, he's suffered this injury a couple of times before, so there's no reason to believe that he can't come back, but it's just tough not having him. But that segues us very nicely right into the defensive lineman performances, top performers of last week. And I like in your notes here because I agree you have a bit of a down week in general. Yeah, there weren't really any. We've had some of those amazing Chris Jones weeks, I believe, and and Cameron Jordan had a really big week. Sometimes there weren't really any of those to speak of this week. Go ahead and touch on a couple of the performances that stood out to you, Ross.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what you're saying about it being a down week, I had the pleasure of watching it in the company of someone I was in a fantasy semi-final with, and we both remarked as the games were progressing, it's like, damn, it's a weirdly low-scoring week for fantasy. Like, where you expect splash plays from the likes of Aaron Donald and all these big name players, and the defensive lineman just didn't come through last week. The guy who had the biggest game was Michael Johnson. 6 total tackles, 2 sacks. I mean, these were his first sacks since week 5. He only has 5 on the year. Now, this was acutely felt by me, considering that against that very opponent, I think I went and grabbed Eddie Yarbrough as a spot start for the week, and I watched Michael Johnson put up a good 27 points on my bench on that team. So I overlooked Johnson and put someone. I mean, Yarbrough did an okay job in the horrific snow game, I guess, between the Bills and the Colts. But yeah, I mean, that game as well had plenty of fancy implications because it was a run-heavy game and we just didn't see anything from the defensive backs, and the linebackers barely got a look in. But yeah, other guys that had a big game, Mario Addison, I think we'll touch on him a little bit more in the waiver wire section. Khalil Mack, obviously, he depends what your designation is. He had a sack last week and 6 total tackles. He's on a 4-game streak at the minute. Maybe not quite living up to some of the expectations we have for him because he's an exceptional player, only 8.5 sacks on the year. But there's one guy I put a note by his name, so I'll let you talk about him because he's a Detroit Lion.
Yeah, that was probably Ziggy Ansah's best performance probably since way back in week 2. That win against the Giants. To me, he looked as healthy as he's looked in a while. He's battled back injuries, ankle injuries, but he ended up with 7 total tackles. I believe 6 of them were solo, so we like those numbers from a defensive end. He had a sack, and actually now I believe he's had sacks in 2 of the last 3 games, and I jotted down in my notes. And in those 2 games, he's also had 11 solo tackles in the last 3 games add up. So his tackle numbers have kind of stood up. It's just been the sacks that have been lacking. So it was nice to see Ziggy get back in the sack column, and hopefully he'll keep it rolling. This week I believe the Lions play on Saturday actually against the Bears, but it was nice to see him in a contract year, and if my Lions have any chance of making the playoffs, slim as they are, they're going to need Ziggy to continue to play at this level.
Yeah, I agree. And it's especially notable he's starting to turn his game on, as we draw to the end of the year in a contract year. We kind of touched on it in a previous podcast, but I'd be very interested to see if he remains in Detroit, and if he doesn't, does he actually get paid going elsewhere?
Right, that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the off season, and he definitely could help his cause by playing at this level. Now let's take a look at a couple of waiver wire options. One of them we already touched on, so let's go back and talk a little bit about Mario Addison.
Yeah, I mean, the waiver wire was a hard one to write this week. It really was. I mean, we're on slim pickings. I'm looking across multiple leagues, trying to make sure that when I'm recommending a player, he's generally available in most of the leagues I'm looking at. And I was a little bit surprised to see this guy's name here, Mario Addison, because he has got 9.5 sacks on the year now. Just it seems strange when you think about it. We're heading into week 15, and we're talking about a player who's likely going to have double-digit sacks, and he's still available. So on that basis alone, he stands out to me because that's the kind of sack potential you wouldn't usually find on the waiver wire this late into the year. But no, he's been playing well as well. I had a quick look at our pass rush productivity stats over the last 4 games for 4-3 ends, and he's actually atop of that list, which made me feel even more confident about recommending him as a waiver wire pickup this week. Now, came to the second guy, and I was struggling. I really was. I looked through the defensive end, matchups and who's available across leagues, and they just all felt like fairly hollow recommendations. So I'm going to draw back to a guy we talked about a few weeks ago at the defensive tackle position. That's Olsen Pierre for the Arizona Cardinals. Now, yeah, this isn't a guy that's going to suddenly win you a fantasy championship, but he could stop you drawing a duck egg at the position, and that's kind of what you're trying to do at this. If you're really struggling for a starter, the worst thing you want to do is go for a huge boom and bust guy if you're a favourite. So someone like Olsen, who's been consistent recently, is probably the kind of guy I'd lean towards now. Why has he been consistent recently? 3.5 sacks in his last 6 games. He's started all of the last 5 games, which is obviously a step up from his role at the start of the season. And they've actually increased his playing time. He's had over 50% of snaps in the last 4. Now, yes, I'm not going to try and tell you this is anything more than like a little bit of a hit and hope DL3, but Olsen Pierre looks like he's a player who is at least going somewhere. He's trending upwards, and that's the kind of profile I'm going to look for if I'm really digging deep for a consistent scorer at this time of the year.
Yeah, players that are seeing an increase in snap counts, especially at this time of year, the fantasy playoffs. I'll be honest with folks. I had Olsen Pierre sitting on my bench last week, and I wish I'd have played him over, Trey Flowers, who I ended up playing Gotcha over. But still, it's good to have him there. As you said, he's on the field over 50% of the time, so opportunity is there. And to touch back on Addison again, you thought he's a great ad if he's on your waiver wire, because I'll tell you what, in a tough matchup last week, and I believe we touched on this in matchups, and just shows you that we can do all the research and we can talk about whatever. We didn't think Carolina had a great matchup against the Vikings, and boy, that defensive line just went out there and got it done. I guess that's why the players do it on the field. But Addison had a sack last week. I believe Quan Short had a couple against the Vikings. So the matchup this week will be easier than what he had going on last week, especially against the Green Bay Packers team that's struggling to protect the quarterback, and I don't believe it's going to be Aaron Rodgers. But let's move on to the linebackers. And quite a few big games here as opposed to the defensive back. And I'll be honest with you right away, Ross, a couple of these really surprised me. Sean Lee, 18 total tackles in his return. I hope folks listened to the show last week, because we mentioned if he's in the lineup, there likely won't be any easing him back in. And boy, he certainly stepped up.
Yeah, I mean, it just reminded us what we're missing on half the time. Anyway, this is a player who missed 5 games this year. I mean, sorry if I'm playing the smallest violin, but Lee is a player who we've always revered when it comes to fantasy, and he showed it again last week. 18 total tackles, as you said, and an interception, his first in over 2 years. It wasn't particularly a great matchup, and he was accompanied as well by his teammate Anthony Hitchens, who we said we have to start downgrading a little bit, but he's someone I think we should definitely be focusing this week on the waiver wire. He racked up 14 total tackles and added a forced fumble, despite a decrease in his playing time. Obviously, with Lee out, he's playing like 95% of the snaps. But with Lee on the field, he only plays about 75%. But yeah, he still managed to put up some really good numbers. So I think consider this guy sort of a low-end LB2 moving forward, and he's someone I would be grabbing on the waiver wire.
Yeah, that performance by Hitchens is one of the ones I was talking about as surprising, because when you look at the numbers that Sean Lee put up, you wouldn't think there would have been a lot of scraps left over for any other linebackers, and Hitchens did a lot better than scraps, and so maybe that's that was a game against the Giants. Maybe we want to get some linebackers that'll be facing the Giants this week in the lineup, perhaps, and that would be that's the Philadelphia Eagles. Maybe we'll touch on that in matchups. And I'll tell you somebody else that surprised me, just because it was not a great matchup and he hadn't been trending in the right direction, but it's a name we know, and he like I said, he really tailed off lately. That's Levante David of the Buccaneers.
Yeah, I mean, David's been a funny one this year. I mean, he didn't have the best of years last season, but he's been making things work for him this year. I mean, he's been flirting in and around the LB1 category. Yeah, like you said, just had 2 or 3 down games when he didn't quite get it done. His tackle totals have generally been low, and he's relied on splash plays, but that certainly wasn't the case last week, because he racked up 14 of them total tackles, added a false fumble and a fumble recovery, essentially one of his best games of the year when it comes to fantasy points. So yeah, that was a huge game from David.
Oh, it certainly was, and I got to watch it firsthand against the Lions, and I was surprised. I'll be honest with folks, I had him as a sit option in my sit article, just because the Lions generally aren't a great matchup for linebackers. They don't have much of a running game, but he was very active in the passing game, and with the passes to Theo Riddick and to Ebron, and so. Boy, David, he really surprised me. Now, these other names, well, let's touch on Brandon Marshall, who we haven't really talked about much this year because he's just been kind of having a meh sort of year, or maybe it's just kind of under the radar, but he certainly had a very a week worth talking about.
Yeah, he definitely did. I mean, this is a guy who at times looked like he could maybe join LB1 territory, but generally speaking has been a really solid LB2 for the last few years of his career in Denver. But yeah, as you said, has been a bit of an underperformer this year. Only hit 10 plus total tackles twice on the season. Last week marked his third straight game with 7 total tackles. But what made it so good from a fantasy perspective was he added a sack and a forced fumble. Unfortunately, this is a particularly painful score for me to bear with because I started Vontaze Burfict in one league, and the obvious replacement on my bench would have been Marshall, and that was the difference between making the final and not. So, and snapping a team streak. The team that I played against had won the league for the last 3 years, and if I played Marshall instead of Burfict, I would have beaten him. So yeah, unfortunately, Brandon Marshall was not on my Christmas card list.
No, I've often said it. Nobody holds a grudge like a fantasy football owner. I still hold a grudge against the great wide receiver Chris Carter, and I'm still holding on to it. And I don't even know how long he's been retired for, but yeah, I'm sure Marshall. Just hearing the name. We'll get stuck under Ross's craw for a while here now, and then we'll touch on 3 more names. And this is ho hum. Look who got it done again: Deion Jones, Luke Kuechly, C.J. Mosley. Generally top 5 starters every week, and they're certainly living up to expectation.
Certainly, they all had great games. But before we move on, I wanted to know one of my friends absolutely despises Jerome Harrison, the running back. I want to say he was a Browns running back who put up about 55 points on in our scoring system about 3 or 4 years ago to stop him winning a fantasy title. So yeah, we like you say, we do. It was still a running joke that he curses that man's name. It was the only good game of his career. But anyway, Deion Jones, 13 total tackles and an interception. The 5th time this season he's hit double digits, and it was his best total tackle game of the year. So Deion Jones is getting it done at the right end of the season for the people that stuck with him. And Luke Kuechly is Luke Kuechly, generally drafted as the first or second linebacker in fantasy football, depending on where you sit on his concussion issue. If you don't worry about it, you take him first. If you do worry about it, he probably goes second. But he had 14 total tackles and a sack. But it's a little bit surprising to me that this was actually only his third game with 10 or more total tackles this season. So it has been a bit of a down year for Kuechly, but it's not been a down year for C.J. Mosley, who is certainly living up to the hype he had as a rookie. 14 total tackles. He's now got 115 of those on the year, and he has cemented himself as a top 3 fantasy linebacker this year. Probably isn't quite number 1 because Wagner's been exceptional, but if he's not 2, he's definitely 3.
Right, and now we'll see with Wagner and the injury he's battling that maybe C.J. Mosley. I know we've talked about Wagner in that conversation for Defensive Player of the Year. Maybe we haven't talked enough about C.J. Mosley, and like I said, if Wagner misses time, maybe Mosley plants his flag in that race and says, don't forget about me. And now, speaking of don't forgetting about people, or not forgetting about people, let me try and speak a little bit of proper English. Let's talk about the waiver wire, and we'll go back and touch on Anthony Hitchens and what he's been doing lately. And again, wow.
Yeah, he's had 29 total tackles in the last 2 weeks alone, which is pretty incredible. 14 last week, despite Sean Lee's 18. The caveat here is we are expecting him to see the field less. Like I said, only 75% of the time now with Lee back. But I still think he's got low-end LB2 potential. Obviously, his scores for the last 2 weeks seems unlikely he's going to be reproducing that, considering he hasn't done it until now. But that's not to rule him out as being someone who's fantasy relevant. If he's out there on a waiver wire, he's definitely worth grabbing this time of the year. The second guy I want to touch on, Michael Wilhoit, we kind of hinted at. I think he's the guy you want to grab from Seattle, especially if Wagner's out. I think he'd probably play instead of K.J. Wright as well. Obviously, he was probably already on the field when they started using Alexander to replace Wright. But when it boils down to it, I'm still not sure if I just prefer Josh Bynes. Saying that, Bynes only had 1 tackle last week. So I'm a little bit wary about what to expect out of those Cardinals linebackers. We kind of touched on it several times. It's a tough week for waiver wire. We're both available on Twitter. If you have any specific players you're eyeing up, feel free to shoot us a tweet, and we'll do what we can to get back to you and give you the best advice possible.
Oh, yes. We love to get the tweets. We love to answer the tweets. And I'm going to go back and talk about grudges again real quick, because I'm going to start a new grudge right now. And I hate to say it, but it's against my man, Paul Pusluzny, who drew his second start last week and got 5 solo tackles, I believe, or maybe it was just 4, but whatever it was, it helped to take me out of the fantasy playoffs. What happened to Paz against those Seahawks after his big week 13? I know he's probably retiring soon, or he should. Here comes the grudge. But boy, Paz, you certainly let me down.
Yeah, it happens. It certainly happens. I try not. The grudges for me are when someone scores really highly against me, really, or I leave someone on the bench, that kind of stuff. I can kind of forgive down performances every now and then. I mean, Puzz is a bit of a legend. He is someone who was one of the 2 own linebackers in fantasy football for many a season. It's kind of, we kind of expected him to be playing this year. Start of the season, we thought he was going to play all year, didn't we? We thought Miles Jack was not going to even get on the field despite all his hype.
Right, and again, it's Ross just proving he's a better man than me for holding a grudge for low points. But no, Paz has gotten me. He's helped me win many a title, so I'll get over that one quicker. But just the sting is still there a little bit from this weekend's loss. But I'll still love Paz in the long run, and I don't really love defensive backs, and we touched on that in the preseason thing, our preseason shows about fantasy. But we're going to move on and talk about some defensive backs, because we had some really good performances and a few surprising names that we haven't really touched on this year, and somebody who I think maybe we both agree had been a little bit underperforming this year, I think had one of the best performances of the week, and that'd be Sean Davis.
Sean Davis did have a phenomenal performance. 12 total tackles, 8 was solo, added an interception. This was his first double-digit game of the year, only his second interception, but it led to plenty of fantasy points. So, if you were someone who's been starting Davis all year, you definitely got rewarded this time.
Yep, and I said, to me, he'd been maybe I was expecting too much. Him stepping in finally now as the strong safety there with Pittsburgh. We've just seen really good numbers there in the past. And secondary and the safeties, especially Palomalu, some of the players of the past for the Steelers. I may have expected too much for Davis, so it's really good to see the youngster. Again, there's a learning curve. He's probably settling in. And speaking of settling in, Bashaud Breeland has settled in, I believe, over the years as a cornerback that quarterbacks like to test. And last week, that did not work out so well as he took the quarterback to task.
He did. His pick 6. It was his first interception of the season. Padded those stats with 6 total tackles. So it was a fantasy relevant week, but it's probably the first one he's had of the year. He's kind of struggled. He is a guy people tend to sniff around in cornerback required leagues. Generally has a pretty good rep, but hasn't been the year for him. So I don't know if anyone's going to have really benefited from that performance, because I would imagine he would have been kicked to the wayside before now.
Yep, that's probably a case of that's a lot of points hanging out on your waiver wire that probably aren't worth chasing, because as you mentioned, first pick of the season. I don't know that I don't think he's going to get Xavier Howard hot, who what does he have now? 4 interceptions in the last 2 games. And again, folks, don't get crazy and chase that. Just throwing that in there. A little public service announcement. We cannot expect 3 straight weeks of 2 interceptions from a player. But boy, I don't know if we expected this from the next player, and this is a personal favorite of mine, as he went to a local high school here in Michigan, and that's Jeff Heath of the Cowboys.
Yeah, Jeff Heath, waiver wire pickup, I would say, this week. He's a guy we mentioned in the preseason as maybe a deeper sleeper, someone to have an eye on. But yeah, he had 11 total tackles and interception this week, but we'll cover him in a little bit more detail when we touch on some waiver wire guys.
Right, another youngster, big week, Matthias Fairley of the Colts.
Yeah, Fairley's a guy who flashed a little bit earlier in the year. Maybe hasn't, quieter period as the middle of the season went on. But actually, over the last 5 games, he's averaging just over 6 tackles a game. Last week was a particularly good one. Obviously, he's in the top performers with 9 total tackles and interception. He's a guy I want to be on the right side of at this time of the year, I think.
Yeah, trending in the right direction at the right time of year. And this last player kind of answers a question that we posed last week, and it didn't take long to delve into the mystery of why Miles Killebrew only saw, I believe, 7 snaps in Week 13, and he only saw 3 snaps last week for the Detroit Lions, and that's because they've moved Quandre Diggs into the starting strong safety position.
Yes, this is one of the tricky ones when we're trying to work out, and you're looking at the raw numbers. Where we did talk about it last week. Actually, we were like, well, be careful of Killebrew. I think he might be the guy, but be a little bit wary. And yeah, it wasn't. We were kind of right, but we hadn't worked out who. And Quandre Diggs. Considering this was only his second start at strong safety, it was a pretty good performance. 7 tackles. A forced fumble and interception. I think, from what I've seen, the game reports seem to be that he was maybe a little bit shaky at times. You'll probably have a much better idea, potentially responsible for some first downs through the air. But, that may not be great for the Detroit defense, but it is great for fantasy owners, because if you show that you're not going to clamp down quickly and fast and stop those third down conversions, people are going to continue to target you. So I think Diggs could quietly be a decent little performer for the end of the year. So if he is available in your league, I would be quite happy to recommend him as a waiver wire pickup this week, especially as he's going to be designated a cornerback. So if you're playing a cornerback required league, it's a double bonus.
Right, and those are the important things to keep in mind, folks. And Ross makes all great points. It's Diggs, again, as I mentioned quite a bit, but I'm sure there's a learning curve for him from switching to strong safety. And he almost had another interception, but it ended up on replay as they showed it bounced off the ground. But it just shows that he's around the ball, and for a lot of the reasons that Ross was astute enough to mention, and that's because they're going his way. I mean, offensive coordinators also know when you've made a position change, and as Ross said, he's going to bring some value because teams probably starting this Saturday with the Bears are going to try to put him in a position where he's going to have to cover and also be able to take the right angles for tackles. And so, while, like I said, it may not be the greatest performance for the Lions, it's going to help him from a fantasy perspective. And A.J. Boye had a very nice fantasy outing last week.
He did. I mean, this is a guy who's been playing phenomenal football this year. He's had 6 interceptions, and he's scoring like a cornerback one. I just felt like, I don't think we've given him enough love. I mean, I know the PFF analysts, they've definitely been praising some of his play this year, but 3 tackles and 2 interceptions last week, he definitely put a fantasy stamp on things. And as I said, he's a cornerback one these days. You cannot look past him.
Yeah, 6 interceptions on season, as you mentioned. That is awesome. And now let's move to the waiver wire. And this was a guy who I actually drafted in a few leagues and went ahead and planted on my bench. And unfortunately, my season is over. But he was helping me, and that's T.J. McDonald.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy I have a pretty good idea about. He's a former defensive back one, even flirted to be the top scoring defensive back a few years ago. Very productive as a Ram, especially in the Greg Williams defense. But why are we talking about him as a waiver wire pickup? Because he was suspended for the first 8 games of the year for some off-field infractions. Since he's returned, he's earned his way into a starting lineup alongside Rashad Jones. Now, again, you might be thinking Rashad Jones is a bit of a points hoover. He's going to get all those tackles and rack up all the splash plays. But McDonald has been carving himself a decent role. In fact, in his 5 games he's played since he's returned, he's actually scored double-digit points in 4 of them in nearly all scoring formats. So I think McDonald's definitely worth adding for the rest of the year. I think he's massively outperforming where he's going to be ranking if you look ranked by total points. If you play in a league where people just go sort by total points, who are the top 5 or 10 players available, I think McDonald might be flying well under the radar. So make sure you go and find him and scoop him up this week.
Exactly. Dig a little bit deeper. Be that savvy IDP owner. And we touched on Jeff Heath. If he's out there, again, another player trending in the right direction.
Yeah, like we said, we did mention he had 11 tackles and interception last week, his best performance of the year. But the reason I like Heath is just because he's just offered a level of consistency. We've talked about how defensive backs can be boom or bust in the past, especially if they're big play dependent. Well, Heath isn't really big play dependent. It's not gaudy stats, but he's had at least 4 tackles in 10 of his 13 games this year, and obviously been a lot better than that in others. I think Heath is worth adding. If you're in a deeper league and you're looking for someone, I wouldn't, Heath is someone who's worth being on a roster at least.
Right. Now let's move on to the matchups. We got just about 11 minutes to go, so we will get to the edge rushers first. And boy, I think we like pretty much all of our Jacksonville or Saxonville edge rushers this week in their second go round with the Texans.
Yeah, what a fun team they have been to watch this year. Explosive on defense, that's for sure. Now, when we're talking Jags, can't really look too much past Calais Campbell. We said before the season started we liked him this year, and he certainly lived up to that with a career high of 13.5 sacks with 3 games to go. This is a player who would never hit double-digit tackles. Even if we excluded the 4 sacks he got on the opening game of the season, he'd still be easily on course to do that. So I'm expecting a big week from Calais Campbell, who maybe hasn't quite been as hot over the last 2 or 3 games, but someone who has been hot, Yannick Ngakoue, he's had 4.5 sacks in the last 4 games. So both of these Jags are certainly going to be well worth starting this week.
That's right. Get your Jags in the lineup. And could it be at long last Margus Hunt? He of originally the Cincinnati Bengals. Is this somebody in a matchup against the Broncos that we could rely on?
Rely on, that's strong words. Strong words. We're talking about week 15 here, Wally, which is either a semi or a final, depending if you have 2-week finals. So, I don't know. If you're really scrabbling, look, Hunt got 7 tackles, total tackles last week, 2 of which were for a loss. He's seeing a big uptick in playing time because Henry Anderson's on IR now. Look, if you're desperate and you don't like our recommendations on the waiver wire and you prefer to go with a pure matchup play, Margus Hunt, there's your guy.
There it is. Yeah, rely might have been a bit heavy, and somebody we've relied on for years for some outside pressure has a nice matchup this week, and that is T-Sizzle, Terrell Suggs of the Baltimore Ravens.
Ooh, yeah, I mean, again, this is a really interesting one to me, actually. I think it's a quite sneaky play. Suggs has 6.5 sacks in his last 5 games, so he is on a bit of a tear at the minute. He's got 11 on the year. This is an excellent matchup. If you're in a big play league, maybe consider Suggs. If not, if you can't get Suggs, Matthew Judon, he has 4 sacks in the last 5 games. I like this matchup. I'm not a big fan of Kaiser, so I think that this could be a sneaky time to go and grab a Raven and play an outside linebacker at linebacker in a big fantasy game for yourselves. It's a bold move, but I don't mind it.
There you go. Grab a couple of Ravens looking to bounce back from that disappointing loss to the Steelers. And speaking of the Steelers, they are a tough matchup for defensive linemen, especially defensive linemen that are battling injuries, and a team, the New England Patriots, that struggle to get to the quarterback in general.
Yeah, I mean, this is just like a siren, an alarm. When you hear the old air raid sirens, there's warning. Yeah, Trey Flowers has missed the last 2 games, so I wouldn't want to get involved with him, despite the fact he had 2 sacks on the last time he played. Eric Lee, I mean, is he designated as a linebacker in your league? Question mark. And again, poorer week last week. And Dietrich Wise, I mean, this is a guy they were probably looking to step up. I thought he was going to step up. I recommended him as a waiver wire pick probably a good month, 6 weeks ago. He was blanked against the Dolphins, and that was an easier matchup than this. So, yeah, all these guys avoid like the plague.
Right, and we're going to look to avoid our Cincinnati Bengals defensive linemen. There's some injury issues here, and there's also the matchup with the Vikings, who we did mention the Carolina managed to have some success against them, but I like the Carolina pass rush a lot more than I like the Cincinnati pass rush.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, Carlos Dunlap has been a little bit of a streaky player this year. We talked mid-early season about how he was having a down season, and then he suddenly popped up with a big game. But heading into this week, he's questionable with a chest injury that knocked him out of the game last week. That did stop a 3-game sack streak he was on, but I don't feel confident about Dunlap at the minute. I mean, so I bemoaned the fact I didn't start Michael Johnson, who again is a Bengal facing a bad matchup with 2 sacks last week. I benched both of these guys, Dunlap and Johnson, in favour of Eddie Yarbrough. So, hey, I'm literally benching these guys myself for no known defensive ends. So, facing a bad matchup, I would recommend that you do the same.
Good point. And one last negative matchup here. The Chargers just don't give up a whole lot to edge rushers, so we're not really high on Justin Houston.
Yeah, I mean, Houston really hasn't had the hottest of seasons. This is a guy who's obviously recorded 20 sacks in a year before, I believe. So Justin Houston, only 9.5 on the year. Did have one last week, but Again, designated a linebacker in a dodgy matchup, you'd have to be a brave one to plug him and play him in what should be seriously important fantasy playoff matches for your team.
Right, now let's move on to the linebackers, and we got about 6 minutes to go, so we're rolling. Once again, the Houston Texans have a very nice matchup for linebackers. They had a good one last week, and one of them came through. Unfortunately, it wasn't the one I suggested starting, Benardrick McKinney, but we like him again this week against the Jaguars.
Yeah, we do. Again, like you said, great matchup, and we've got a trio of guys here to watch out for. So McKinney's the primary linebacker here, the one we know about, the one who's flirting with LB1 rankings. So McKinney are definitely playing, but it's Cunningham and Cushing who we want to kind of clue in on now. Cunningham actually led the team last week with 9 total tackles. He obviously is retaining playing time with Cushing back in the lineup. Cushing played strong side last week, typically not the best place to rack up tackles from, but if you are struggling, we've talked about all these injuries. Cunningham, I could definitely make a solid case for playing. He, like I said, led the team last week with 9. Got a great matchup this week. Cushing, it's probably a bit more of a swing for the fences play if you prefer matchups to rather than getting a guy who has 5 tackles every week. Maybe you'll consider Cushing, but like I said, it's a matchup play, not a positional play because he's playing the strong side.
Right, and we've liked our Cleveland Brown linebackers all year long. We like them against the Ravens. We also like our Miami linebackers against the Bills. Go ahead and touch on those matchups.
Yeah, the Ravens have been an excellent matchup, and Joe Schobert and Chris Kirksey have both been excellent plays for both of their owners this year. Jamie Burgess has really stepped up, coming in for Jamie Collins, and that trio combined for 28 total tackles last week. 9, 10, 9 going across the board there. 9 Schobert, 10 for Kirksey, 9 for Burgess. If I was going to pick one, it's definitely Schobert. Obviously, he has 122 tackles, is the second best in the league. But yeah, the question here is, do you start Burgess in this matchup if you need someone? He had 9 last week. He has shown some flashes of value. I prefer Burgess to Cushing if you put a gun to my head, but I'd play Cunningham over both. And then as for the Bills, Alonso is only really playing to me as like an upside LB3, and Lawrence Timmons is not even that good. He's been an LB4-5 maybe with a good matchup. So, talking about these fringe players, of all of these, you're going to start your studs. You're not going to play your rubbish guys. But yeah, for me, Cunningham would probably be the leader over Burgess, and I'd have probably Timmons over Cushing. But yeah.
Well, there you have it. Those are the matchup info that you like from Ross there, and the linebackers that we like. Linebackers we don't like generally play against the Redskins, and that would be our Cardinals.
Oh yeah, Carlos Dansby has been fairly solid, and he's continued to be solid throughout his career. He's either a high-end LB3, low-end LB2. I think this is a tougher matchup for him, so if you do start 3 linebackers, you might want to think twice. But the trio of Deon Buchanan, Josh Bynes, and Hassan Reddick, I just can't make head or tail of it. Bynes we kind of clued in on. I thought he had a great week the week before last, but just 1 tackle last week. He did get 9 fantasy points. Oh, sorry, that's 9 in my league because he had a splash play. But yeah, I looked at the snap counts and I'm looking at their points and what's going on. And outside of Dansby, I think this is one you have to avoid really unless you're absolutely desperate.
Right, and we're not crazy about our linebackers going up against the Raiders, so maybe temper expectations for Sean Lee and Anthony Hitchens. You probably don't bench them. Certainly don't bench them, but maybe temper expectations. And then also Levante David coming off his big game against the Lions. It's a negative matchup with the Falcons.
Yeah, I don't think we can bench David or Alexander either. It is a poor matchup, but these guys, last week, 14 tackles for David, 12 for Alexander. It's a tough one when you see, and Lee and Hitchens obviously combined for 29 between them. When you see them in these negative matchups, sometimes you just got to double down and just be like, right, these are good players, let's play them. It's tough, but I'm just giving you the take.
There it is. It's, again, temper expectations. Maybe we got a couple minutes to go here. We got the safeties to look at, and we're looking for Sean Davis to keep things going in a positive matchup against the Patriots.
Yeah, definitely. Top scoring fantasy defensive back last week, and could he do it 2 weeks in a row? The Patriots have given up a lot of points to safeties. Unfortunately for me, Rashard Jones didn't quite come through like he did the first time, but maybe Davis can double up with 2 games back to back.
That's right, and we're looking for a bounce back week from Keanu Neal and a positive matchup against the Buccaneers.
Yeah, 4 tackles last week. Wasn't his best performance, but this is a great matchup, and Neal's the kind of player that gets his nose in the box and hits people. So I do like this one.
And we're going to keep riding the Quandre Diggs train in a positive matchup against the Bears this week for my Lions.
Certainly, like I said, he's a sneaky waiver wire grab for me. This is a great matchup. He put up points last week. He is going to be tested. I'm all over Diggs.
And now let's look at some negative matchups, and this one is probably a hands-off situation. We've touched on him earlier. Landon Collins.
Yeah, raise the alarm and run away. Landon Collins, whether he starts or not, I think, well, if he starts, you're facing injury and a bad matchup, not far from ideal. I think you would have to consider benching him, and that's a crazy thing to say about Landon Collins after last year. If he doesn't play and they go with Burley or Andrew Adams, don't even consider.
That's it. And not crazy about the Browns going against the Ravens. So Derek Kindred, I like the show notes here, folks. It says Derek Kindred, yuck.
Yeah, I mean, Kindred's a weird one for me. I've tried to convince myself he's a waiver wire pickup for 2 or 3 weeks. Like, it's weird. He's had matchups, well, not this week, and he's had things have just trended in his direction. It looks like he should score points, but that linebacker unit in front of them is not sorting him out, despite the fact he's getting his nose in the box. It's a terrible matchup as well. I can't even bear to write his name in the waiver wire column at this time of year. So yeah, you shouldn't be starting him.
I think yuck sums it up right there, and we'll take it on home with. It doesn't look like we'll see the return of Aaron Rodgers this week. It doesn't matter. The Packers are a bad matchup for secondary players, and so we're not really loving Kurt Coleman or Mike Adams.
Yeah, the couple of veterans to end the show on, but they haven't really had seasons to take note of. At best, absolute best, I'd call them DB4s this year, so they probably shouldn't be in your fantasy lineups, and now they've got a negative matchup too in a crucial time of the season. Yeah, stay away from these two, unfortunately.
There you have it, folks. The matchups that Ross Miles like, I concur. Make sure you always read Ross's IDP waiver wire article on Tuesdays at Pro Football Focus. And now Ross is going to do what he does best, and that's take the show home.
Cheers, Wally. It's been emotional, and no doubt we'll be back next week to hopefully reminisce on some better results for our teams. Rams, Seahawks, that's an exciting one for me, besides the division. But until next week, adios amigos.